The air in the room seems wrong. A white fog escapes every breath, even though the window is closed. A girl lies at the center of the bed, eyes empty, voice torn apart and rebuilt in something ancient. The walls groan as if they want to breathe. A crucifix tilts on its nail, and in the spaces between the words, you can hear the slow scrape of something moving. Anyone who has watched The Exorcist knows that sensation. That scene left millions haunted, yet almost no one asked the simplest question. Who was that presence before it slipped onto film? What kind of figure could survive for thousands of years, hidden in fragments of clay and ritual whispers, to reappear in a modern bedroom? Behind the special effects and the fear lies an entity far older than cinema. Archaeologists found his image on small amulets buried beneath Mesopotamian homes. Priests once spoke his name with care, while mothers pressed his likeness against their skin in the hope he might guard them through childbirth. His name was Pazuzu. His story doesn't fit clean categories. The ancients feared his plague winds and begged him to drive away other spirits. They treated him like a living contradiction, a demon strong enough to stop demons. Later, faiths erased those complexities, turning him into a symbol of pure blasphemy, a rebel against divine order. By the time The Exorcist resurrected him, centuries of distortion had piled on top of something that once terrified whole civilizations for reasons far stranger than possession. That is where we'll go. We'll follow the traces he left through ancient tablets, the cultic practices that surrounded him, and the forgotten mythology that still leaks into the film. The further we go, the clearer it becomes why his presence doesn't feel like fiction, and why the cold of that room echoes something far more ancient than horror. Long before the word demon existed, the people of Mesopotamia were already surrounded by them. Their world was a web of fragile cities, carved between rivers and deserts, where drought, disease, and invasion could erase entire generations overnight. Nothing felt stable. Every disaster seemed to arrive with purpose, as if carried by an invisible will. And so they began to give those forces names, faces, and habits, cataloging the unknown as if it were a hostile bureaucracy. Unlike later religions that separated gods from demons, the Mesopotamians saw no such divide. Their pantheon was crowded with spirits that ruled storms, plagues, madness, famine, and sudden death. These beings were part of the structure of reality, older than human morality, indifferent to human life. Survival meant negotiating with them. Priests worked like archivists of fear, memorizing thousands of spells, seals, and rituals to hold the chaos back. This worldview created a demonology that still unsettles people today. It described evil not as an accident, but as a permanent element of the cosmos. No one could destroy it, only redirect it. That logic survived long after their cities fell. When later cultures absorbed fragments of these beliefs, they reshaped many of those spirits into gods of dread. Baal among the Canaanites, Moloch in the Levant, and other figures whispered about for centuries as the patrons of secret blood cults. Even in the modern era, countless conspiracy theories and occult groups claim to guard hidden remnants of those ancient rites, convinced they descend from the oldest pacts humanity ever made with darkness. The result is a legacy that feels disturbingly alive. Most ancient religions faded into harmless myth, but Mesopotamian demonology never softened. It portrayed the world as a battlefield of invisible predators, all of them older than the gods people pray to now. That sense of something ancient, hostile, and still watching is what makes it resurface again and again, in secret societies, in whispered invocations, and in the shadows of our horror stories. The earliest traces of Pazuzu appear in the ruins of Mesopotamia, among the shattered bricks of Assyria and Babylon, etched on clay between the 9th and 4th centuries before our era. This was a region that lived under constant threat: famine, plague, sudden winds that swept entire harvests into dust. People filled their cities with shrines to dozens of gods, each tied to natural forces they could neither control nor ignore. It belonged to none of the orderly pantheons. He emerged as a spirit from the margins, feared as the embodiment of the southwest wind, the hot, dry current that came from the deserts and carried death on its breath. Ancient texts describe that wind as a bringer of fever, miscarriage, and famine. It blew from the land of the dead, curling over the living like an invisible serpent. Pazuzu was its face. Whenever that wind struck, people believed it was his arrival, his talons tearing through the air, his wings beating rot into the crops. He was not honored in grand temples or paraded through the city like other gods. He had no festivals. Instead, people whispered his name with dread, hoping to keep his attention away. The few times they dared to summon him, they did it with objects small enough to hide in a fist. Archaeologists have uncovered hundreds of tiny amulets and figurines bearing his image, unearthed from ancient homes and buried under thresholds. These were not offerings, but shields. Women in labor often wore them to keep away Lamashtu, the demoness who hunted infants. In the logic of Mesopotamian magic, only something more terrible than Lamashtu could drive her off, so they turned to Pazuzu. He was the monster they could not kill, enlisted to hold back the others. The amulets show what the ancients believed he looked like. His body was a hybrid nightmare, human torso lined with scales, clawed feet like a lion or eagle, and membranous wings slick with oil. His hands ended in curved talons. His face was twisted into a permanent snarl, bulging eyes, a muzzle shaped like a rabid dog, teeth bared in an eternal warning. From his lower body hung a serpent-shaped phallus, a symbol of fertility that made his form even more grotesque. The combination signaled that he belonged to no single realm. Part beast, part man, part corpse, part god. No one carved him large. There are no statues of this demon towering in temple halls. His image was deliberately kept small and hidden. The ancients believed that drawing his gaze too boldly would provoke him. A figure the size of a thumb could repel him or persuade him to guard a household. Anything larger might summon his wrath instead. This ritual caution shaped every piece of his iconography. He was power contained, chaos compressed, danger forced to work as protection. Many of these figures surfaced during modern excavations at sites like Nimrud and Nineveh. Museum cases now hold what were once desperate charms: bronze plaques with his head and wings, small clay figures with his snarling face and taloned feet. To archaeologists, they are artifacts. To the people who made them, they were the only barrier between their families and the desert wind. This duality, destroyer and protector at once, is what made Pazuzu so feared. He belonged to a logic older than morality, where survival meant bargaining with what you feared most. He could bring famine, yet he could stop a worse death. He could carry plague, yet drive off the demoness who hunted newborns. Those who invoked him accepted the risk because there was nothing stronger to stand between them and the chaos outside their doors. And in their eyes, that made him indispensable. After the fall of Babylon, the empires that had once feared and bargained with Mesopotamia's spirits collapsed, and their languages faded from use. Clay tablets crumbled, temples emptied. What survived were scattered fragments, broken amulets, half-erased names, and a few passages copied into foreign libraries by scribes who no longer understood the context. The web of ritual knowledge that had once explained these beings dissolved. Without that framework, later cultures encountered their remnants as pure terror, strange, monstrous figures stripped of their original purpose. Over centuries, those fragments slipped into the occult traditions of the Mediterranean and Europe. Medieval scholars, obsessed with compiling catalogues of demons, translated whatever names they could find from ancient sources and grafted them into Christian cosmology. In this system, there was no space for ambiguity. Western demonology demanded that every entity serve either heaven or hell. So the Mesopotamian plague spirits, once feared and sometimes even petitioned as protectors, were recast as demons of corruption and disease. Pazuzu was swept into this process. His role as a wind spirit became Lord of Pestilence. His connection to protective magic was erased, and he was listed in grimoires alongside figures like Asmodeus, Belial, and Baal. By the Renaissance, this reclassification had hardened. Occultists treated him as a prince of the infernal hierarchy, sometimes describing him as a subordinate of Lucifer or a spirit of contagion who brought madness, sterility, and famine. Renaissance demonographies, such as the Pseudo-Monarchia Daemonum and later the Dictionnaire Infernal, echoed this pattern, weaving his name into their sprawling catalogues of hell. He no longer appeared as a wind spirit on a household charm. He became one more enemy of God, bound into the machinery of Christian demonology. That shift changed how people feared him. Mesopotamians had seen him as dangerous but predictable, a force that could be held at bay. Western occultism recast him as actively malicious, driven by hatred of creation itself. This made him far more terrifying to the Christian imagination. He ceased to be a part of nature and became an invader of it, a corrupter who entered bodies and minds. That idea would later shape how he was portrayed in The Exorcist and almost every appearance since. In modern occult currents, his name has continued to resurface, though rarely with a clear lineage. Some branches of Thelema have invoked him symbolically as a destructive aspect of the air element, a counterforce to spiritual ascent. Certain neo-pagan and chaos magic groups cite him in rituals meant to banish sickness by personifying and binding it, echoing his original role without realizing it. Even within strands of symbolic or theatrical Satanism, his image sometimes appears as a mask of desecration and blasphemy, a figure used to break taboos and dismantle sacred order. There are documented modern rituals where practitioners attempt to summon him directly, often through reconstructed Mesopotamian chants blended with modern ceremonial magic. These rites usually aim to harness his association with plague, decay, or destructive winds, though they are rarely grounded in authentic Mesopotamian practice. In most cases, they are products of the medieval and Renaissance reinterpretation, a Pazuzu imagined through the lens of Christian demonology rather than the one feared in ancient Babylon. Much of the fear he inspires today comes from this transformation. The protective spirit became an archetype of corruption, stripped of context and inserted into a hierarchy of evil that would have been unrecognizable to the people who first named him. The modern occult world inherited that version, and with it, the unsettling sense that somewhere behind all these systems, an older presence still watches from the dark, unchanged by the stories wrapped around his name. When William Peter Blatty wrote The Exorcist, he could have chosen any demon from Christian lore. Medieval grimoires offered dozens of notorious names: Beelzebub, Asmodeus, Belial. Yet he reached far deeper, pulling a forgotten figure from the ruins of Mesopotamia: Pazuzu. This was not random. Blatty wanted the possession to feel older than Christianity, older than the church's rituals, like a force from a time before morality existed. This entity was perfect for that role. He came from the cradle of civilization, centuries before the Bible, and carried the aura of something primal and uncontained. He wasn't part of the neat hierarchies of hell invented by medieval theologians. He had no allegiance, no obedience to cosmic order. That made him unnerving to anyone who understood demonology, a presence too ancient to care about human notions of good or evil. For Blatty, this made the story far more frightening. The priests in his novel weren't facing a rebellious angel. They were confronting something that had already haunted humanity for 3,000 years. There was another reason as well. Pazuzu embodied physical corruption. In Mesopotamian belief, he ruled the hot southwest wind, the one that carried fever, rot, and famine from the desert. That made him symbolically perfect for a possession narrative. His arrival meant decay entering the body, the mind breaking down from within, innocence collapsing under invisible pressure. The very symptoms described in ancient texts, madness, convulsions, wasting, echoed what Blatty wanted Reagan to endure. He didn't need to invent a mythology. He just had to revive one that once terrified entire empires. Friedkin embraced this logic when adapting the novel. He and his team studied Assyro-Babylonian artifacts in the Iraq Museum, tracing Pazuzu's distinctive shape: dog-like head, bulging eyes, eagle talons, reptilian body, wings stretched taut. They rebuilt him on set as a towering statue buried in the sand, not to explain the plot, but to frame the possession as something ancient and impersonal, something that existed long before Christianity named evil. That opening scene in Iraq plants this idea wordlessly. The priest who represents modern faith stands trembling before a forgotten god of plague. Choosing Pazuzu also allowed them to bypass the overfamiliar image of the Christian devil. A horned Satan would have been theatrical, even comforting in its predictability. It was alien. His face belonged to no moral system the audience recognized. This made the possession feel less like rebellion and more like infection, a foreign presence awakening inside the human world. Viewers couldn't rationalize him as evil in the way they understood the term. He simply felt hostile, like an ancient, natural disaster given intelligence. The decision worked. Even though he barely appears on screen, his shadow defines the entire film. Every gust of wind, every sudden chill, every flicker of his face carries the weight of that archaeological truth. Audiences felt they were witnessing something older than religion, a remnant of humanity's first fears. That was the power Blatty wanted, not a devil from Christian doctrine, but a spirit so old it seemed to predate the idea of God. And that is why, out of all the demons the modern world could imagine, they resurrected Pazuzu. When the first archaeologists began digging through the mounds of Mesopotamia in the 1800s, they weren't looking for demons. They wanted lost cities: Nineveh, Babylon, Assur. They found them, buried beneath layers of sun-baked clay, and with them came something no one had expected. Small figures with snarling faces, wings stretched, claws out, and eyes bulging as if caught mid-scream. These were the first modern encounters with Pazuzu. Teams led by pioneers like Austin Henry Layard and Hormuzd Rassam unearthed entire palace complexes, their walls carved with battles and omens, and among the rubble lay dozens of strange bronze and terracotta objects. Some were no larger than a hand, yet the detail was unmistakable. A dog-like muzzle, eagle talons, scaly limbs, membranous wings, and a serpent-shaped phallus curling from the lower body. Local workers often refused to handle them. Several excavation journals describe how laborers would wrap the pieces in cloth without touching the metal, murmuring prayers as they passed them to the European scholars. Even the archaeologists, steeped in rationalism, admitted their unease. Layard noted the hideous and malign vigor of the figures. Others described feeling watched by the gaping eyes, even after the objects had been packed away. The artifacts were catalogued as protective demons or wind spirits, but their aura clung to the expeditions. Crates bound for London and Paris went missing in sandstorms or sank in river crossings. One shipment to the Louvre reportedly arrived after half its labels had rotted away. The crates warped and blackened despite fair weather during the journey. By the late 19th century, museums began displaying them to the public. The British Museum, the Louvre, and later the Pergamon Museum in Berlin placed the Pazuzu figures in cases among their Mesopotamian collections. Visitors were fascinated and disturbed in equal measure. These were not graceful gods or heroic kings. They were raw, animalistic, crouched as if ready to spring. Newspapers of the era sometimes described them as fiends or heathen devils, echoing the same unease their creators had once felt 3,000 years earlier. Over time, a whisper of superstition grew around the pieces. Guards claimed the gallery lights near them flickered without cause. Conservators spoke of sudden migraines after handling them. Some museums quietly rotated the figures out of display for years at a time. Whether any of this was real didn't matter. What mattered was the impression they left. They looked alive, and they seemed to carry something with them. That sense that something ancient and hostile had been pulled back into the world cemented Pazuzu's modern reputation. He was no longer just a name on cuneiform tablets. He had a face again, a body, and a presence that unsettled even the rational minds who unearthed him. When The Exorcist introduced him to cinema decades later, it drew on that same feeling. The idea that these figures had not been created so much as exhumed, and that whatever they once contained had followed them out of the ground. What makes this demon so disturbing is not just what he does, but what he is. His shape alone unsettles the mind. The human brain is wired to sort living things into clear categories: man, beast, bird, serpent. But it fuses all of them in ways that refuse to make sense. His body is humanoid, yet covered in reptilian scales. His feet end in lion-like claws, his hands in hooked talons. Wings stretch from his back like those of a bat, yet his head pushes forward with the snarling muzzle of a dog. From his abdomen coils a serpent-shaped phallus, a grotesque symbol of fertility turned into threat. Looking at him, the mind can't decide what it's seeing. That confusion itself becomes the horror. This hybrid form carries another, deeper tension. In his original context, Pazuzu was feared as a bringer of plague and famine, yet invoked as a protector against even worse forces. He embodies the idea of something dangerous pressed into service for protection, a predator guarding the household. That inversion of morality is deeply unsettling. It blurs the boundary between good and evil, making safety feel indistinguishable from danger. On a psychological level, this triggers a primal fear, the realization that the same force we depend on could turn against us at any moment. He also represents what humanity can never truly control. Pazuzu was the spirit of the hot southwest wind, the current that swept from the desert carrying fever and rot. He stood for invisible disasters, plagues, stillbirths, crop failure that strike without warning and leave no enemy to fight. Civilizations rise by imposing order on nature, yet Pazuzu embodies the parts of nature that ignore order entirely. He is chaos given a face. To see him is to remember that civilization is only a thin layer over something wild, and that layer can tear. This makes his terror profoundly intimate. He doesn't threaten through claws or teeth alone, but through what he makes people become. In possession stories, he does not simply attack, he corrodes. Innocence collapses into obscenity, love into violence, rationality into madness. The victim's body still lives, but no longer belongs to them. That echoes the ancient fears he once embodied, fevers that hollowed a person from the inside, plagues that made neighbors unrecognizable, storms that turned familiar ground into ruin overnight. The true horror of Pazuzu is not his violence, but his ambiguity. He is protector and destroyer, human and beast, sacred and corrupt. He embodies everything that resists being contained, by temples, by categories, by the mind itself. This is why he feels so ancient, because he mirrors the first fear humanity ever had, the fear that the world is not stable, and that what we trust to keep us safe may be the very thing that takes us apart. Pazuzu did not fade back into history after the Exorcist resurrected him. Once his name returned to circulation, he began mutating inside modern culture, appearing everywhere, yet never fully understood. His face surfaces in horror films, role-playing games, and music videos. His form appears on metal album covers and in the iconography of underground art scenes. People tattoo his snarling head on their skin, often without knowing who he was, as if compelled by something older than the conscious mind. He became a sigil of dread, yet also of fascination, like an ancient glyph reinserted into the collective unconscious. This resurgence is not accidental. Many scholars of religion and anthropology have noted that this demon carries what they call a liminal quality. He stands at the border between protection and destruction, order and chaos. Jungian interpreters have even described him as a raw archetype of the shadow, the part of the psyche that contains everything repressed, dangerous, or unacceptable. In this reading, the fear he inspires is not about physical harm, but about the collapse of boundaries. The realization that what you trust to defend you might also be the thing that undoes you. That paradox makes him resonate with people living in a world where the old moral binaries feel unstable. In the occult underground, this has made him strangely attractive. Certain chaos magic practitioners view him as a force of purifying corruption, a power that tears down stagnant structures to clear space for transformation. Some Thelemic writers mention him as a chthonic air spirit whose destructive current can be harnessed to burn away weakness before higher initiations. A few neo-pagan sects and left-hand path groups frame him almost as a demonic patron of threshold states, illness, madness, possession, liminality itself. To them, invoking Pazuzu means inviting disorder as a form of rebirth, an echo of how Mesopotamians once called on him to repel even worse evils. There are also small, documented cultic circles that claim to venerate him directly, often blending fragments of Mesopotamian invocations with ceremonial magic and even elements of Lovecraftian ritual theater. They tend to describe him not as a personified being, but as a field of entropy, a sentient current that embodies decay, fever, and the collapse of boundaries between self and environment. While these groups are fringe and often secretive, their existence shows how Pazuzu has shifted from archaeological relic to active esoteric symbol. This has created what some researchers call the Pazuzu effect in modern demonology. Whenever contemporary media needs to convey an entity that feels truly ancient and corrupting, it borrows his traits: hybrid form, invasive presence, violation of the body and mind, and above all, moral ambiguity. He has become the template for how we imagine possession, an enemy that does not conquer by force, but by dissolving identity from within. Even unnamed, his silhouette haunts depictions of demons across film, games, literature, and art, quietly shaping the modern archetype of evil. In this sense, it has become more than a myth. He has become a recurring signal of something the human psyche still fears, but cannot suppress. The idea that chaos is not external, but buried inside our systems and our minds, waiting for cracks to open. 3,000 years ago, people hid his amulets in their homes to contain that force. Today, people paint him on their walls and skin, speak his name in rituals, and carry him into the collective imagination. Perhaps without realizing they are doing exactly what the ancients once did. They are keeping him alive. Many figures in demonology are frightening because of what they represent. They are framed as embodiments of sin, rebellion, or punishment. That structure gives them limits. It stands apart because he never had those boundaries. He didn't emerge from a moral system designed to teach lessons. He came from a world that saw spirits as unpredictable, natural forces. That makes him harder to rationalize. There is no clear rule for when he harms or protects, and this unpredictability is what makes him feel more threatening than demons that follow a fixed role. Some argue he shouldn't be seen as especially disturbing because he was originally used as a protective spirit. But that is precisely why he is so unsettling. Most demons are designed to be entirely hostile, which makes them simple to understand. Pazuzu undermines that clarity. Another point often raised is that his modern reputation comes mainly from The Exorcist, and therefore it is just fiction. Yet the film only amplified fears that already surrounded him. His face had disturbed archaeologists decades earlier. Museums displayed his amulets behind glass because even inanimate, they provoked discomfort. This wasn't a Hollywood creation. It was Hollywood tapping into an unease that had existed since the first excavations brought him back into the light. Psychologically, what makes him stand out is how directly he connects to real human vulnerabilities. He was believed to ride the winds that carried plagues, and those plagues produced symptoms people still fear: fever, convulsions, mental breakdown. Modern possession stories reuse these same patterns. The terror isn't that Pazuzu kills, it's that he corrupts, that he takes control of a body or mind while leaving it outwardly intact. That reflects a universal fear of losing autonomy, which is far more personal than being attacked by an external monster. This combination, an unpredictable nature, a dual role as protector and destroyer, and a direct link to the collapse of body and mind, is what keeps Pazuzu singular. Other demons became symbols that fit into orderly hierarchies. He remains chaotic, ambiguous, and tied to tangible human fears. That's why, despite centuries of reinterpretation, he continues to feel more disturbing than any other demon ever unearthed. Across this entire journey, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Pazuzu was never erased. He survived the fall of Babylon, centuries of silence, and the collapse of every culture that once feared him. When he resurfaced, it wasn't as a symbol safely confined to books or rituals. He returned as something people still felt. He embodies everything humans have never learned to control: disease, chaos, the breakdown of the body, the disintegration of the mind. That is why he resists fading into harmless mythology. Gods and devils can be placed in systems, but it has none. He was protector and destroyer at once, and that contradiction stops people from feeling safe around him even now. This is what makes him endure while countless other demons became caricatures. He does not exist to teach a moral lesson or to punish the wicked. He exists as a reminder that fear came before morality, and that there are forces older than every structure humans built to contain them. Pazuzu's name has become a permanent fixture of how we imagine evil, not because he shouts louder than the rest, but because he never left. He is still here, on ancient amulets, in museum glass cases, in the sound design of horror films, and in the unspoken thought that something invisible could be watching, waiting, and moving closer. That is why, thousands of years after the first hands carved his face, it remains the most disturbing demon humanity has ever unearthed.